Hello and welcome to the National Black MBA Association's Wednesday webinar series. Thank you for joining us. Before we get started, I'd like to take a moment to acquaint you with a few features of this web event technology. At any time during today's program, you may adjust your audio using your computer volume settings. On the right-hand side of your screen, you will see a Q&A window. To submit a question, type your question in the small text box at the bottom. When finished, click the send button. You may do this at any time during the program. All questions that you submit are only seen by today's presenter. Questions will be responded to in the order in which they are received and will be addressed at the end of the presentation. However, please note that due to time constraints, our speaker may not respond to all questions submitted. At this time, I'd like to introduce our speaker, Vanessa Vaughn. Vanessa is the President and Chief Executive Officer at As Follows, an enterprise resilience boutique consulting firm specializing in strategies that enhance security and awareness in crisis and emergency situations. She has developed enterprise crisis management, business continuity, and training and exercise programs in 4 countries and 16 domestic locations. Her expertise is in equipping executive leadership teams with an organized response to global risks that impact $50 billion businesses. Vanessa has a proven track record to enhance an organization's profitability, maintain a company's reputation in adversity, and their ability to operate. Welcome, Vanessa.
Thank you, Gary. Good afternoon, and thank you all for joining today's webinar. I want to kick us off by thanking the National Black MBA leadership team for seeing the value and the importance of crisis management, especially as a topic for business leaders in our current society. As questions arise, please feel free to go ahead and send them in, and Gary and I will be sure to address those at the end of the webinar today in the last 15 minutes of the conversation. If you are certified from a crisis management or business continuity or in the risk management space, this is a session that you can utilize to document your continuing education units or credits towards your certification. I'm excited about this topic as I know it will provide you with a rewarding opportunity to help you and your team to substantially lower your risk. We'll go ahead and get started. The objectives are simple today. We have 3. Gain awareness of risks and threats, learn how to develop an all-hazards plan, and we're going to help you understand best practices so you and your team can respond confidently. After today's webinar, you should be able to construct a process that provides attention to the organizational concerns while being supportive of the day-to-day processes of your team. So this webinar is divided into 3 sessions. We're going to talk about before the crisis, during the crisis, and after the crisis. Before we jump into crisis management, I'd like to level set and set the tone of what I mean by all these terms of business resilience, emergency response, and different things like that. So business resilience is your ability to absorb the impact and bounce back in a crisis. And under the business resilience umbrella, there's 4 pillars that complete business resilience. The first is emergency response. It's that immediate reaction or a response to ensure life safety. So that's typically when a fire happens or when you have to evacuate. How are you ensuring the safety of your personnel, which is your most critical asset? The second pillar under business resilience is crisis management. How do you minimize the damage to profitability, reputation, and your ability to operate? And this is something that we'll take a deep dive into today. The third pillar under business resilience is business continuity. If you don't have your people, your technology, your data, or the building that you walk into every day, how do you continue business 1 month, 2 months, 1 year, or 2 years out? They're essentially the strategies to enable a response for your critical functions to continue business. And lastly, disaster recovery. I always call this the first cousin of business continuity. Disaster recovery are the activities to reestablish your technology services. Crises sometimes happen because of events that were not foreseen by people. And surprisingly, they're common risks that are ignored. So the elephant in the room is an appropriate question here because these are risks that are quite obvious to outsiders from the organization, but apparently not to those that are involved within the company. So why do elephants exist? Well, there's 7 reasons that we've been able to identify of why they exist, and I'm going to take you through those quickly, and then we'll get into some of the elephants that may be in your room that can potentially cause a crisis. The first reason why is that elephants are asleep. Stakeholders are aware of the risk, but they don't do anything about it and hope that it will not eventuate. Sleeping elephants always come in at the most inconvenient moment in time. The second reason why elephants exist is that it's not my elephant. This is when no one is willing to take responsibility for managing the risk. The third reason why an elephant exists is you deny the elephant's existence. This often manifests itself as a case of collective and willful blindness to obvious risk. No one acknowledges the risk, perhaps out of fear or being responsible, which is similar to point number 2, which is it's not my elephant. The fourth reason why elephants exist are the elephant has powerful friends. This is when some of your stakeholders, often those that have clout or are in leadership positions, can actually increase the likelihood of a risk through bad decisions. A common example that we've seen in the workplace is the imposition of arbitrary deadlines based on fantasies rather than facts. The fifth reason why elephants exist is that the elephant might get up and walk away, which is wishful thinking, where the team assumes that the risk will magically disappear. And this is the hope and pray method that is quite common in many companies. The sixth reason why elephants exist is that the elephant's not an elephant. This is a situation where a risk is mistaken for an opportunity. And yes, this does happen. If you've ever worked in technology on a project team and your team members may see that new piece of technology as an opportunity, but in reality, it may very well pose a risk to the business. And the seventh reason why elephants exist is the elephant is dead. This is exemplified by the response, quote unquote, that is no longer a problem here, when asked about the status of a risk. The danger in that type of situation is that your elephant may only be fast asleep and not dead. So ignoring risks is easy because it involves no effort whatsoever. However, this is dangerous because once these risks eventuate, they can, like those invisible elephants, wreak havoc and cause a crisis to occur. So if you're a small business, corporation, nonprofit, or you work within a government entity, is the elephant in your room negligent? You have a lack of normal care or attention towards your products, services, or your customers. An example of negligence can be a data breach that leaks private information about your customers. It can be a car accident, property damage, or a lawsuit that has financial losses and impacts to your reputation due to the publicity of the method. Is your elephant company culture? The tone at the top of every company describes the climate and the overall philosophy set by your board of directors and your leadership team, which drives the culture and behaviors of all of your employees. This tone permeates throughout the enterprise in a number of ways, including executive communications, onboarding, and learning programs, as well as the policies and procedures designed to empower and to control employee decision-making. An example of culture is in 2017 when Wells Fargo's former CEO, John Stumpf, said that employees, quote unquote, failed to honor the bank's culture to put the customer first. Remember, corporate culture is the tone at the top of the company. Is the elephant in your room business acumen? Your ability to effectively communicate, always looking ahead, being proactive, being strategic, and being able to have this vision to understand your competitive threats. Oftentimes, startups and entrepreneurs are great at a skill or at a function, and so they start a business, but one thing that they lack is business acumen. Is the lack of your business acumen elephant in your room? If you work within a corporate environment and you may not have had a business background before starting there, Is the elephant in your corporate world the fact that you have a lack of business acumen that may be affecting your leadership decisions? Is the elephant in your room due to an unclear strategy? Is your strategy evolving as the world around you is rapidly changing? What's your competitive advantage now? And what about in the next 5 to 10 years? Why is a clear strategy so important? It boils down to 3 things: performance, productivity, and profit, both now and in the future. Because simply, if you don't adapt, you will die. The world is changing. Even successful companies need to realize that what made them successful today is not what will make them successful tomorrow. A perfect example is Blockbuster and Netflix. What about accountability? Is that the elephant that's in your room? It looks like unclear responsibility throughout the organization, or where people don't follow up, whether it's at the top or it's through all levels of management. Do you have compensation plans that reward poor performance within your company? Do you have management behavior that looks like dysfunctional leadership, which results in bad strategic decision-making and poor employee performance and execution? Do you have a flawed corporate strategy? When your company executives push a flawed strategy, 2 things typically happen. The first is that the smart people in your company call them out on it, publicly or privately. The word gets out, and then management credibility suffers big time. The second thing that typically happens is that people will start covering their behind, pointing fingers and acting passive-aggressively. Are you creating a culture or the elephant in the room with a lack of accountability? And lastly, is it a process problem that is the elephant in your room? Business systems and processes are documented procedures that allow our businesses to run without us or to help us. Typically, these processes and procedures are in the back office and things that we don't see on a day-to-day basis. Is the elephant in your room a concern with the processes or problems that you have within the organization? So if you're a small or a big company, analyze the elephant in your company. What are you not looking for? What are the topics that you and your team should but do not discuss? What are the first steps that you can take to remove the size of the elephant? And again, the reason why we focus on this is because oftentimes those elephants can be the exact reasons why a crisis begins, or they can add to a crisis and make it worse. So I encourage you to get strategic about how you find the answers to these questions. Have your staff write the answers in an anonymous box. Oftentimes, they see what you are not looking for. And don't forget your culture. The tone at the top of your company describes the climate and the overall philosophy, and it drives the culture and behaviors of all of your employees. So now that we've talked about how to identify some of the elephants that can create a crisis or make a crisis worse, it's a good segue into risk assessment. This process will help us to uncover the internal and external risks so that your crisis management team will know what they should be planning for. A risk assessment does 4 things. It identifies the risks, it defines the controls, it evaluates the cost of those controls, and it involves an evaluation of the probability that exists. So what's the value? What's in it for you? Why should it matter to you as a leader? From a crisis management perspective, if you don't know what you're susceptible to, how will you know what you're planning or preparing for? Let's look at it like this. If you live in Los Angeles, California, should you be preparing for earthquakes and wildfires or hurricanes and snowstorms? A risk assessment allows us to focus on impacts as well as causes. It facilitates rapid and effective response. and it increases the resilience of your organization, which is your ability to absorb the impact and bounce back in uncertainty and in chaos. Rather than assessing your return on your investment by money earned from a risk assessment perspective, companies typically evaluate it by money saved. Understanding the severity of risk and its impact on the availability, duration, and spread across your business is good information for you to know before the crisis and not afterwards. Why? Why does it matter? Well, depending on what your company is willing and able to tolerate from a risk perspective determines the amount of money and the amount of time that your business will invest to mitigate or reduce the impact on the business. So here's an example. In 2017, December of 2017, the Atlanta Hartsfield-Jackson International Airport experienced a power outage. And that power outage had a medium availability in yellow. It was an intermittent total loss of service or serious reduction in service. The duration was low because that was an 11-hour power outage that lasted. However, the spread of that power outage was high as it impacted many businesses and functions. That 11 hours worth of time where there was no power cost Delta Airlines $50 million. They had to cancel over 1,400 flights. So let's put this into perspective. In December, it is a part of a 21-day period where it is America's busiest travel season, where approximately 51 million people are traveling around the country. So if you own an accounting firm or you work for an accounting firm and there's a power outage between January and April, it may very well affect your business very differently than if it happens in August. Understand the severity of an impact to your business because you need to be able to know what are you willing to tolerate. So if you're a big or a small company and you have yet to do your risk assessment, you now have an opportunity. Here is your to-do list. And some of these may tie into the elephants in your room. Identify the threats, vulnerabilities, and impacts. Evaluate the effectiveness of those controls and safeguards. Understand your organization's exposure to risk and loss. Assess, state, and prioritize your level of risk so you know what is important to your company. And lastly, implement appropriate controls to prevent and mitigate those risks. So what does that mean? Well, let's say you're Bank of America and you have millions of people who are your customers, vendors, and suppliers who are depending on you for money. And your data goes out. The bank probably has a less than 4-hour requirement, meaning in less than 4 hours, I need to be able to see my data, which in the business continuity crisis management world, that means I have to have redundancy in my system. So then the question becomes, well, how much are you willing to pay to ensure that your systems never fail? Is it $100 million? Is it $20 million? Is it $5,000? Those are things that you need to understand ahead of time, and your risk evaluation will allow you to do that. So once you've identified the elephant, you understand the risks and the severity of the impact, now you can get into your crisis management team. What type of people do you need on your crisis management team? The picture that you see here is an example of the incident command system, which is a government methodology and an approach to crisis management. There's a core team, as you see in purple and in the blue boxes, and then there's an ad hoc team on the bottom, which are in the yellow boxes. The yellow boxes are typically deployed when there's a large crisis, such as an Equifax or Mandalay Bay active shooter situation. Keep in mind that a crisis management team that works for Walgreens will not be the same setup for CVS. Every crisis management team is going to look different, and it's going to be unique based upon your organization, your culture, and the types of risks that you are preparing and mitigating. So as we look at this chart, the purple and the yellow boxes all report into the crisis manager. Why is that? Because the number one problem in every crisis is communication. Typically what happens is people in the yellow and purple boxes and throughout the company look for and want to get information from other sources as opposed to trusting the process of the crisis management team. This structure funnels communication within the crisis management team up to the executive team. As you notice, the crisis manager or crisis managers, depending on how your company sets it up, is the only group of people that will be communicating to the executive team. The role of your executive team or your C-suite is to set the strategy and to provide support for that crisis and communicate with the board of directors. Their role is to not be a part of the crisis management team itself. So if you work for a manufacturing company, it may make sense for your head of safety and security that has been with the company for 20 to 30 years, that really understands the business, that understands the operation, but also has a relationship with the executive leadership team. It may make sense for that person to have the role as crisis manager. If you're working for a Fortune 100 company, your top concern is reputation, then it may make sense for your head or your chief of corporate security or public affairs to fulfill the role of the crisis manager. Either way, your executive team should buy off on that decision. Jumping down to the yellow boxes, I want to cover those briefly. The finance role is responsible for ensuring that the costs are being monitored for the overall fiscal guidance of the company. Well, why is that? Let's go back to the Delta Airlines example. There was a $50 million impact for 11 hours worth of time. How are we tracking costs? Delayed customers, paying pilots and the crew overtime, sending people home, bringing in more people, having to pay people for food or putting them up in hotels and lodging. Those things cost money. How does your accounting and your finance team track that? Those systems and those procedures need to be set up before your crisis happens and not in the middle of it when you don't have time to do it. The planning box in the yellow typically takes the strategy set by the executive leadership team and they write it out for the crisis management team to go and solve. And then the operations team to the left of the planning box takes that strategy and makes it tactical and they execute that strategy. And lastly, logistics. That role is responsible for ensuring that anything that the crisis management team needs, that they have it, whether it's airplanes, whether it's hotels, whether it's tarps. Their role is to ensure that whatever is needed for that crisis, that the team has it. If you're in corporate America or a government entity, you want to make sure you have at least 2 backups per role and that you train with the backups, because 90% of the time, your primary decision makers are on an airplane and they're in a meeting or not available during a crisis. If you are a small business, your crisis management team is going to look very different because you may not have the depth of resources. So ensure that at a minimum, your core team, the purple boxes and the blue boxes, are covered for small business. So this is a perfect picture of what you do not need. The longest plans are not the best plans for a crisis. You want a plan that is supportive, that helps your team stay in control in uncertainty and chaos, not a document that you will never use. So you want something that is going to be clear and concise. It needs to be specific for the roles and responsibilities so that there is no confusion. Everyone should know what their role is and how they play a role on the crisis management team. So as many of you may be using this presentation to build your crisis management plans, think about this. Within the first 4 to 6 hours, you always want to ensure employee safety. That's always going to be a part of your crisis management plan. What is your process to ensure that your employees are safe? If you don't own the facility that you currently work in, what is your building owner and operator's process for ensuring that people have made it outside of the facility safely? Communication and notification. Do you have mass notification systems to alert people when things are happening that they should be aware of? Do you automatically have a conference bridge that your leadership team knows to dial into when there is a crisis? Again, these are things and the how that you really want to cover before the crisis happens and not after. Within the first 4 to 6 hours of a crisis, you also want to control and evaluate the situation. How do you do that? What's your team's methodology for how you evaluate and verify the facts versus things that are not facts? You also want to determine the impact level. Where are we? Is it really a crisis or is it an emergency? Is this a disaster? What is a crisis to your business? What does it mean? If you have a retailer that has over 2,000 locations, is a power outage at a store a crisis for the company, or is it a crisis for that store? So being clear on what a crisis is and what it is not for your entire company. So again, if you're writing a crisis management plan, these are the items that you want to include and flesh out. The how you do this is what is key. So after you've identified your crisis management team and you have a plan, the next step in the process is training. And as a leader, you are always going to be tasked with ensuring that your executive leadership team buys in and participates. So how do you keep them engaged? Tell me and I'll forget. Show me and I may remember. Involve me and I'll learn. Adults learn by doing. This quote really is about training, which we call engage, equip, and empower, because that's the desired outcome of training. How are you equipping them with the right information they need to be successful? How are you empowering them to be better leaders in uncertainty? There's many different methodologies and schools of thought as it pertains to training. So we're going to touch on 3 of those today. The first is informational, which is basically bringing awareness, typically through a workshop. The second is instructional. That's the how-to, the action items, getting those out and having people talk about it to be sure that they actually understand how to execute their role in a crisis. This is typically facilitated through a tabletop exercise where you will have your senior leadership team and their backup in a room discussing a case study, asking them questions, and really getting down to the how. The last type of training that you can do within your own work environment is experiential, where you learn by doing. This is when you work with your SWAT team and you bring them into your HR building and you say, hey, pretend like you are an active shooter. Walk through this building as if you are looking for the intent to kill. Help us to see some of the elephants in the room that we have not identified. This is a full-scale exercise where they typically bring in their entire team and different things so that you as a company can see the full impact of that crisis that it can potentially have to your business. If you're just starting out and you're just starting to build your crisis management framework or your program, you really want to start at the informational level and continue to gain awareness and clarity on the process and your roles. If you have a more mature program and you have a business resilience structure and a methodology, you should be doing instructional exercises twice a year. And you should be doing the experiential exercises at least biannually with your leadership team. Now we're transitioning into the middle of the presentation where we're going to focus on during the crisis. So once again, this is all about crisis management, which is about 3 things: your reputation, your profitability, and your ability to operate in uncertainty and chaos. I like to look at events in the news as it gives us a reminder of the crises that are happening around us every day, which just proves to show that things happen and we never know when it can be us, but regardless, we have to be prepared. In January of 2018, H&M selected a black Swedish child to model a sweatshirt that has the words, "Coolest monkey in the jungle." Social media responded in outrage immediately. H&M lost their brand collaborator, The Weeknd. They even had celebrities such as LeBron James, P. Diddy, and other notable writers from various news outlets speak out and speak against the image that you see. South Africans responded in outrage by turning over clothes and racks throughout the stores, which led H&M to close 17 stores in South Africa. Ironically, the child's parents did not see this concern as others did across the world. My question to you, with what you know now, what can you do to mitigate this from happening to your brand? What does this say about the culture of H&M? What would you as a leader say about it? Would you say anything as a leader? Should diversity and inclusion be a part of all levels of the company? This photo has been captured and discussed from the United States to China to South Africa. What would you have done differently if it was you and your team? What's the elephant in the room at H&M? In November of 2017, a 26-year-old boy walked into a church in rural Texas and killed 26 parishioners and wounded 20 others. That shooting lasted 7 minutes. That's equivalent to 2 full songs on the radio. It's also the same amount of time it takes a first responder to arrive on the scene. Can you imagine sitting in a room where someone is actively shooting at you for 7 whole minutes? Most people died outside of the fact that there was an active shooter because they did not run for the exit. The Department of Homeland Security has a strategy, run, hide, fight. And they've been amending this because what's happening is people are running to hide. That's not the intent. The intent is for you to run outside, away from the shooter, to hide if you don't have another option, and your last resort is always to fight. Think about it. You've never seen an active shooter chase a person outside to shoot them. So run for the exit. Our corporate security advisor on our team always advises churches to throw your hymn books. Why would you do that? Because active shooters are not expecting for you to fight back. Throw them off their game because they're not expecting it. This gunman was chased by a neighbor, and they found him dead off the side of the road. My question to you, with what you know now, what can you do to mitigate this from happening to your church or to your business? How can you train members of your congregation or your staff? How can you better protect your facility? How can you teach your children how to respond? Is there an elephant in the room at your church? In 2016, Uber was breached and didn't tell their 57 million customers that were affected. They paid the ransom, which set the tone for all other companies, and it set an expectation for criminals. Small businesses typically cannot just pay the ransom, though. With what you know now, what can you do to mitigate this from happening to your company? How do you know your information security is properly working at your company? When's the last time your team tested the system? How does the leadership team get involved with these trainings? What is the elephant in the room as it relates to your cybersecurity program? What are you not looking for? Did you know that on average it costs a corporation $1.3 million to manage a data breach? It typically costs a small business $117,000. So what are some things that you can do and consider, especially for those of you who may be a small business or a smaller organization? Get your cyber insurance. It's fairly economical. And even if it's not, what investment are you willing to make to your business to protect it? If you do not have anything in place, you have already been breached. You just don't know it yet. And lastly, what is your communication strategy? How do you mitigate a lawsuit from your client if you are the reason that their data has been breached? In 2017, many powerful men in business had sexual misconduct at their workplaces that were publicized, from actors to entrepreneurs, NFL owners, etc., including Russell Simmons. My question for you, what would you do differently with what you now know? How do you mitigate this from happening to your company? As a leader, have you created an environment where sexual misconduct is acceptable? Are you prepared to deal with the backlash if it ever arises? Do you and your team discuss how you will respond? What does this say about your culture? What is the elephant in your room at your company? Abraham Lincoln once said, "Character is like a tree and reputation like a shadow. The shadow is what we think about, and the tree is the real thing." People think about the shadow, which is your company's reputation. The shadow is the Yelp reviews on our food site, or it's the social media posts where your customers can post online about you anywhere at any time. Warren Buffett says it takes 50 years to build a reputation and 5 minutes to ruin it. If you thought about that, you would do things differently. I've never met a business leader that joined a company or started a business with the intent for it to fail. So once something does happen and you're in the middle and you are responding, what do you do? Well, luckily, it's only 4 easy steps. Number 1, you activate your team. Number 2, you assess the situation. Number 3, you confirm the facts. This is always an area of improvement because oftentimes people hear and they see things, but there is no process to validate that that information is actually fact. And lastly, communicate. And essentially, you will follow this process until the crisis is over, and then you're in your recovery stage. I worked with a team one time. It was a Fortune 100 company, and I had a vice president of process and strategy. And she said, "I've never been in an active shooter. I've never experienced a data breach. This may not be the place where I should be on the team." And it's a great question. And in reality, we're not looking for you to be the only person on the team that's solving the problem. But with your entire crisis management team, you all have enough brain power in the room to solve and to manage the crisis. You just need to know what your roles and responsibilities are and to be given a guide. That's why it's important for you to plan ahead of time. It's all about teamwork and collaboration. So which company are you? Are you well practiced on the top? Well practiced on the bottom? You spend your time preparing. It doesn't take you as long to react or to recover. Or are you the company on top? Are you poorly planned? As you see crises happening in the news, you're now going to be able to start to see their level of preparation just by how long the crisis actually plays out. So how do you know if you have a good plan or not? What if you currently have something in place? How do you know if it's right? Well, if you do not have a resilience program, formalize it. Create a governance structure, create your crisis management team, and create your plan, and then train your people. Engage, equip, and empower them. If your resilience program is not sponsored, you need to ensure that there is an executive member on the leadership team that sponsors the program and that will create the culture of resilience. If a risk assessment was not conducted, not only do you need to conduct one for your company, but you need to relay the importance of risk resilience to your partners. Are there people that you're depending on for your business or for your organization? If they are, what is their business continuity and crisis management plan? Have you covered those? If your business recovery strategies are not documented, which means if you do not have a business continuity plan, document them. Have a strategy for what you will do if you do not have your people, your technology, your data, or the building that you walk into every day. If people are not trained on their responsibilities, your next step is to ensure that people participate in training semi-annually at a minimum. And lastly, if your plans and capabilities are not exercised, ensure that you begin exercising them and review your plans annually and update them. So again, how do you know if you have a good plan or if you've made the proper preparations? On the left side of the screen are things that poorly planned companies do. On the right side of the screen, those are things that well-prepared organizations do. The last piece of this presentation is after the crisis. We've covered the before, the during, and the after. Now, what do we do afterwards? Most corporations' top concern is reputation. So that's what their crisis management program is planning for. On the x-axis, we have time. Crisis, or pre-crisis, crisis, and post-crisis. On the y-axis, we have reputation. What are the strategies you and your team are taking to rebuild the reputation? Your goal is to make sure that the red on the right side of the chart continues to go back up after your crisis. I worked for this company, Gulfstream Aerospace Corporation, and I was a part of the business continuity and crisis management team. On April 2nd, 2012, a test flight crashed in New Mexico and it killed 4 of my former coworkers. This was the new flagship aircraft that customers were waiting 7 years to have built, a $65 million jet that they had to wait 7 years to actually ride in. So how did they maintain and build an even longer backlog and keep their competitive position within their market? It's all about company culture, integrity, and accountability. Number one, they assessed what went wrong and they discovered the many elephants that were in the room that created the crisis. Number two, they prioritized which items to focus on in the short term and in the long term. Number three, they embraced their responsibility and they owned it. Number four, they implemented the changes. Number five, they measured success with employees on the front line, engineers, and customers. This is how you earn your trust back. So restoring trust is not rocket science, but you must earn it. It is not given to you. How can H&M, Uber, Equifax, Wells Fargo, how can they earn your trust back? Well, first, to initiate trust, we must be worthy of it. Trustworthiness, in turn, consists of three main characteristics. Number one is your technical competence to perform your task reliably, which is basically your ability. Number two, it's having gentle and kind motives, being compassionate. That's your benevolence. And number three, it's acting according to acceptable ethical principles such as fairness and honesty, which is your integrity. If you display these attributes consistently and credibly, you will be trusted by all except the most paranoid. If you get any of these wrong, your reputation will suffer. Remember, trust is made, trust is remade, strengthened or undermined in every encounter, whether it be personal or in business. So never waste a crisis. Sit down with your leadership team after something goes wrong and talk about what worked, what didn't work, what should we do differently, and set SMART goals for your short term and long term. Secondly, adjust your plans. And lastly, engage, equip, and empower your team all over again. A few facts that I would like to leave with you today for you to consider and take back to your team. 25% of daily revenue is lost by a company within the first 6 days of a disaster. Hurricane Harvey, Hurricane Matthew. 63% of IT security breaches are caused by human error. It's the people. 44% of businesses never open their doors again after losing their records in a fire. 2 million Americans are impacted by workplace violence every year. $36 billion is the estimated annual cost associated with workplace violence. And lastly, I've left some additional resources for you all to consider, and I'll walk through these briefly. Ready.gov is an awesome website that has very simple, easy-to-use information. It's very easy to navigate, and it can help you prepare your business, your government. It can help you develop plans for your families as well as your children. Oftentimes, the plans are very basic, but if you're just starting out, this is an excellent resource for you to utilize, and it's free. The second one are 5 trends impacting small businesses in 2018. The fifth trend is pretty interesting, so I encourage you all to check out that article. The third one is Mass Shootings in America, a Serious Problem by CNN. This is a great article to get more insight on the problem with active shooters in America, but more importantly, how we're comparing to the rest of the world. The fourth one is by Ready.gov, and cybersecurity is what it pertains to. And it has 3 things that it focuses on: preventing, detecting, and securing, which is what you want to do. So check that out for more information. And lastly, crisis management and value proposition. How do you get buy-in? How do you get your executive leadership team to actually buy in? With that, I will kick it to Gary for the Q&A.
All right. Thank you, Vanessa. As a reminder, the Q&A window is located on the right-hand side of your screen. To submit a question, type your question in the small text box at the bottom. When you're finished, click the send button or push enter. Please note that due to time constraints, our speaker may not respond to all questions submitted. Our first question: what is the call to action for a cybersecurity attack for an organization that houses personal and financial information?
That's a great question, especially in a day where cybersecurity attacks are happening daily. I would tell you that these are things that you want to have beforehand. So typically, you should be having conversations with your legal team, and oftentimes there are companies, especially if you're a large organization, there are companies that will help you manage that cybersecurity crisis. They may help you establish your crisis communications protocol. They may help you to walk you through the process of some of the things that you have to go through in order to get your data back, or for you to be aware of the different types of organizations that you may have to engage with, such as the FBI or different things of that nature, depending on the source of that cybersecurity threat or that attack. So in short, I would encourage you to ask these questions of your legal team, your public relations team, and really understand, if it were to happen in my company, what are all of the things that we are going to have to consider and even thinking back to how much data can our company afford to lose before it starts to impact our business. Those types of questions are going to feed into your business continuity plan, but your prep work is going to be critical in order to get the answers to those questions.
The next question, business threats and market analysis risks seem much easier to predict than human behavior like sexual misconduct, et cetera. What advice do you have for companies on how to prioritize what risks we focus on mitigating?
Excellent question. I worked with the company, and so what this particular company did that I thought was done well is they had a list of all of the risks and threats through their risk assessment process. They took the top 10 or 20 from within the company, and they surveyed the executive leadership team across different lines of business. And each executive leadership team had to vote on what is the most critical thing that we should be focusing on and what is the most critical thing that can cause an impact to our business. So they got buy-in across the company. Once they spread that out and got the buy-in and received the feedback, they took the top 5 to 10 risks that were agreed upon across the organization, and that's how they developed their crisis management training program for the next year to 2 years. So every quarter, they started to train themselves on the top risks that their senior leadership team had identified. The reason why that's important is because once you start to document that you know you have a problem, if you don't begin the steps to do something about it, you can be found negligent, which is going back to some of the elephants in the room.
Our next question, in today's world, it seems that apologizing after the fact is the norm. Just how effective are apologies, and when is it appropriate to not issue one?
That's a really good question. Again, your response is what matters. And everything you do depends on the culture. There's oftentimes when you want to make sure you're consulting with your legal team to know what their recommendation is on what to say and what not to say. But you always want to be and to have compassion for your people, because at the end of the day, we're all in the business of serving people. No matter what you do in your environment, your customer is always a person. So it really ties into your company culture. Oftentimes, public relations and communications teams do a great job of continuously practicing because they're always thrown curveballs and different types of questions, especially when they're doing live media and PR. They need to be equipped on what is the culture or the cadence of this company. What does our leadership team determine to be a satisfactory response? If we think back to H&M, there has yet to be a member of the executive leadership team who has spoken about that particular crisis. Personally, as a person who may shop in H&M, is that acceptable to you that a person in leadership has yet to apologize or has yet to address it? So again, it just really ties into your company's culture.
Our next question deals with reputation. What are effective tactics for measuring reputation?
Ooh, now this is a really good question. As you start to walk into a crisis, you're going to start to see things within, really the external environment, but also your internal corporate culture is going to start to change because we're dealing and working with people, and people have opinions and they have feedback. And so I think, that really ties into the point of your response and how you as an organization are showing your integrity for that particular matter. It's about earning the trust. If you put in the work to have people earn your trust back, if you're out there assessing what you did wrong, determining different ways that you could have played that particular situation out, then that's really how you're going to be able to assess the return or people's perspective of that risk. I'm going to pull up that slide, how to earn your trust back. And that's an example I don't know if you guys can see this. But yes, so this example right here, when Gulfstream crashed that particular site, like I said, they did 5 things that rebuilt the trust. They never lost market share. They never lost their position within their competitive space because they assessed the problem. They prioritized what was important. They killed lives for an airplane that was not even open to the public to even fly yet. It could have very easily happened where many of those customers dropped their names off of that backlog, but it did not happen. They embraced what they did. They admitted it. They implemented procedures and processes to make changes, and they measured those results. So again, I would say it's about your process on how you and your company take responsibility to earn trust back. Think about it if it was you. How would you want a company to earn your trust back? Put yourself in your customer's shoes, and I think that can be a good way for you to learn how to solve that particular problem.
All right, we've got time for one more question. The recent situation in Hawaii where an alert was mistakenly sent to residents seems to be quite unique. Do you think they handled the situation correctly? Based on your presentation, they seem to follow your recommendations, but considering that this is a government entity and not a corporation, are there different ways in which this could have been handled?
You know, that's a really good question. And I actually had a friend of mine who was on vacation, and she fled to a shelter. I got the alert and sent it to her, and by the time she got it, they knew that it was not a real threat. I think that anytime you miscommunicate things, you can't take those words back, and it causes an interruption, and it causes people to go on alert. Did they handle it correctly? I mean, I would say the fact that they responded as quickly as possible and that they addressed it, yes. But also things are going to happen. As much as we depend on technology, technology also fails. And again, over 64% of errors when it comes to cybersecurity and information security is often human caused. So, I mean, hey, you know, when things happen and we miscommunicate, the best thing that you can do is rapidly communicate with people so that they know what to expect. Great question.
I'll tell you what, we've got another question here. Let's try to squeeze this one in real quickly. Is there ever a time to not address a crisis that is made public?
You know, that's a really good question, and I honestly think that will always be a question where I will say engage your legal counsel, because there can be things that I am unaware of, my own elephant, because I don't have a background in legal. So I would recommend that it just depends on the legal recommendation from your organization. You want to be careful of admitting fault. I do know that, but the extent of that's really more of a legal question, because it's always going to depend on the crisis.
All right, before we wrap up, Vanessa, let me throw it back to you for any final remarks or comments.
Yes, so this last slide of the presentation just has our links to any way that you would like to connect to us, whether it's via email, a blog, or through social media. I've truly enjoyed the opportunity to share this insight with you, and I encourage you guys to reach out and ask questions if there's anything that you need. As one can see, having a proactive plan is designed to be very supportive of your current business processes and an energized and systematic methodology, which places your teams in control of an otherwise chaotic circumstance for others. Thank you very much for your time.
All right. On behalf of Nbmbaa, I'd like to thank Vanessa for a great program and you, our audience, for your participation in today's event. This concludes today's program. Again, we thank you and have a great rest of the day.